It's my absolute pleasure to give a warm welcome to our next speaker, Sebastian Risi. Sebastian Risi is a professor at the IT University of Copenhagen and co-director of the Robotics, Evolution and Art Lab. He won several international scientific awards, too many, in fact, to list here. And his aim is to make machines more adaptive and to allow them to learn from and work together with humans. He's a published author both in major machine learning / AI conferences and in conferences on human-computer interactions. So without further ado, welcome, Sebastian. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. So today, I want to talk a little bit about the research we're doing on artificial evolution, and specifically trying to evolve agents that learn a little bit more like animals, like taking some small steps towards this grand goal of artificial intelligence research. And so there are two major things that I'm going to address in this talk that I think is critical if we want our AIs to be more general and have a more general intelligence like animals and ultimately humans. And one of them is that we want our AI methods to learn faster and being able to adapt rapidly to changing environments. So on the left side, we have this giraffe that can, after only a few minutes, it learns to, it can walk. Because it's born with innate knowledge and then learning mechanisms on top of it that allow it to really rapidly learn how to walk. While in machine learning, we still need many more trials for these systems to figure out how to do these things. And they're also very adaptive. If an animal gets injured, they're very quick at adapting to this change. So how can we evolve? How can we use artificial evolution to evolve similarly capable agents? And the other quality that animals and humans possess is that we can kind of do planning, like we can imagine outcomes of our actions. So this ape would be able to plan in its head that if it uses this tool, then it's able to get the reward. And so can we give our agents similar kind of what is also called a world model, like a model of the world in their heads that allows them to plan their actions and then execute them before trying out everything directly in the real world, which would be a lot less efficient. So I'm going to talk about these kind of two strings of our work, more adaptive agents, and also can we evolve this kind of planning world models for faster learning. And I want to start with this idea of world models. And there is already actually quite a lot of work on this. And the relevant work that we are building our approach on is called this world model approach by David Ha and Schmidhuber from 2018. And basically in their work, what they did is they have this complex neural network where you have, can you see my mouse, by the way?
Yes.
Okay. So they have this complex model, and the idea here is that the model gets just pixel inputs from the environment. In this case, it's this 3D Doom environment, and you have these three components, where one is this autoencoder, so that just compresses this high-dimensional input into a lower-dimensional vector, and then you have this MDN-RNN, which is like a forward model, which tries to predict the next kind of time step. So it tries to predict the future, which you can then use to plan your actions. So we have this component that tries to predict the next time step, and then we have another component that's this controller that takes both like the compressed representation from this autoencoder and whatever this forward model, this recurrent network predicts will happen next. It takes both of these as input and then decides the kind of action it should do. Like in this case, it could decide to go left and right. We see another domain later where we have car driving, where it could also say left, right, or going forward. But one kind of drawback with this method is that all these components had to be trained separately. So this world model approach showed like really good performance in tasks that standard reinforcement learning was not able to solve. but it did require all these components to be trained separately. So first we had to train this autoencoder separately on 10,000 random rollouts, collecting a lot of images, training an autoencoder to compress them and reconstruct them. Then when that's trained, then we had to train this forward model. So we would take a current time step and try to predict the next time step. And so we had to also train this on these 10,000 random rollouts. And then when we have both of these systems trained, then they use the evolution strategy CMAS to train this controller, taking both of these into account to decide its actions. So what we were interested in, can we train such complex heterogeneous architectures end-to-end through evolution alone? So getting rid of all these separate training methods, only using evolution to train the whole system, is that possible? Because if we can do that, then we can also scale it to maybe more complicated architectures, and we can get rid of these extra training steps that also require you to initially collect these 10,000 rollouts randomly. As Dennis and Jean-Baptiste already talked about, there's a lot of evolution has recently been shown to be quite competitive to, for example, reinforcement learning approaches. So we have this work by Such, Deep Neuroevolution, and the work by Salomon et al. Evolutionary strategies that showed you can play like Atari games just from pixels. Evolution can find good controllers that sometimes even outperform established deep learning methods like DQN or PPO. But what these approaches were not used on before was to train more complex architectures. So most of the time, these deep reinforcement learning approaches have focused on training simple feed-forward architectures like the one we see on the left side. So just a few layers. This is the original kind of DQN architecture that was made famous by DeepMind like 6-7 years ago. And this is just a feed-forward architecture. But then this more complex architecture, like we see in the word model, that allows you to actually do this kind of imaginative planning inside the head of the agent to decide what action it should do next. That's required a more complex heterogeneous architecture. So can we scale these genetic algorithm approaches, neuroevolution approaches to these more complex architectures, which would allow us to then also solve more complex problems? And I guess I don't have to, you just had, I guess, the lecture about neuroevolution, so I don't really have to repeat it. But the basic idea is you optimize the parameters of this neural network that then interacts with the environment. One interesting thing that's different in neuroevolution is that we basically often only take the reward into account from the end of a rollout. So while in reinforcement learning, you get a reward maybe each time step, in neuroevolution, oftentimes you just sum up all these all these rewards that you collected, and you only use the final reward at the end. So oftentimes, if you have very dense rewards, deep reinforcement learning methods might be better. If you have very sparse, neuroevolution works better if you have sparser rewards of the environment, if you only get rewards every once in a while. And so basically what also Jean-Baptiste was talking about, this NEAT was a very influential method developed by Ken Stanley and Mikko Leinen, where you grow these networks over time. And then we have this HyperNEAT. In my own work, we did ES-HyperNEAT, which allows you to not only determine the connection weights, but also the structure through an indirect encoding. But what we have seen recently is that actually the most simple approach, now people call it deep neuroevolution, works actually the best currently. So all these methods that are more complicated, like NEAT, HyperNEAT, currently they don't really show their advantage so much. So this deep neuroevolution idea is the most simple, basic approach, and it seems to work just fine, which is where you just, how you train these networks is that you just add random Gaussian noise to all the weights you have. So you just concatenate the architectures we use, and they used for this DQN work, you have like over 4 million parameters. You just have a long list of them. You generate your population by adding Gaussian noise to these parameter lists. And then you select the top X%. and you allow them to produce for the next generation, again adding Gaussian noise. So the most basic, simple evolutionary algorithm you can imagine, which people a few years ago did not think this would work. But apparently, if you use deep enough networks and you have a lot of parameters, this over-parameterization seems to help, and they perform really well. So then in this work, we wanted to scale this idea of deep neuroevolution to these world models. So here's just another image of this world model that you've seen before. This time we use this, I talk a little bit more about the domain we use, which is this car racing domain, which also requires this kind of forward planning. So if you drive a car, you want to plan a little bit ahead of what's coming so you can adjust your actions. If you only look very short-sighted, then you will not drive very well on these tracks. So that's why it's a good domain to test these kind of world models. And again, so we just use these Gaussian mutations. We don't use any crossover. And we have these three different components. We have this visual component. We have this, here's this forward model. And then we have this controller. And here you see like side by side. In the original world model training, you needed to train the VAE separately, the MDN-RNN separately, and then the controller. We just train everything with a simple genetic algorithm, even a very small population size of 200. So it doesn't get much simpler than this. And the domain is this, what I already said, the car driving domain, and it looks quite simple. Like you have to, from pixels alone, you have to control this car. And what makes it difficult is not just if you drive simply and slowly around the track. What makes it difficult if you wanted to get a high enough score to pass the benchmark solving the domain, which means you need to get a score of 900, over 900 on average across 100 random tracks. So you get evaluated 100 times, different tracks. And in all of these examples, you have to drive really fast to get that score. So what we see here is that other methods like DQN, A3C, they perform quite poorly. So they get a score of, around 300, 600, 650. So none of these get close of solving this domain. And some of these techniques also rely on pre-processing, like edge detection, stacking recent frames, while we don't use this in our work. And so the experimental setup we use is, so we have the car racing domain. We have these three network outputs to go left, right, and accelerate or brake. And you get a reward of minus 0.1 every frame and a reward of plus 100 divided by the number of tiles for each new tile you visit. And we only take into account the accumulated reward at the end of an episode. So we add all the rewards during the whole rollout. And that's the fitness of this individual that determines its chances of reproducing for the next generation. And we test then a few different approaches. So they are the experimental setups you see here. In the mutate all, we just concatenate all the parameters of this large model, which is like around 4 million parameters, and mutate all of them every time we mutate. In another approach, we with equal probability, either mutate the visual component or the forward model or the controller component. So the idea here was that maybe sometimes it's not always good to change everything, but maybe sometimes it's beneficial to only change one of these components. And then in another setup, we only train the controller, because some work has been shown that even random convolutional networks already do very well at extracting some useful patterns. So we also did this. And then the other setup we did is this discrete, where one benefit of evolution is that it's very agnostic to the type of architecture and problem. So we also used it to train a discrete representation where we have discrete latent codes, making it the discrete world model. And the idea there was that if we can do that, then later we could use this to also do some planning, because it might be easier to do planning in this discrete space than in a continuous space. And here you see the training results. So evolution is basically able to optimize all these different variations we have, and it doesn't make too much difference if it's if we muted everything or just one component at a time. It's also able to optimize this discrete representation well. The only thing that didn't work, and we also didn't really think it would work, but this is one thing that the reviewer suggested, and if the reviewer suggests some things, then you have to do it, is if we only train the controller and keep the convolutional network like randomly initialized, that doesn't quite, that doesn't work. And so here we see this. So then we tested these also, like their generalization performance, meaning we put them in 100 randomly generated tracks. And here you see an example of how it drives one of those. This is the compressed visual representation the network gets as input. And we can see that we get a score of over 900 across these 100 rollouts, effectively solving the task. So the only other method at the time of this paper was published that can solve the task together with the original world model by Ha and Schmidhuber. And one thing that we were also really interested in is what kind of representation would pure evolution discover in this context? So in the original world model, you have this autoencoder that you train in a supervised way to compress and being able to reconstruct, which means that visual scenes that are similar will have a similar latent code, a similar compressed representation. So evolution, we don't do this. We don't train the autoencoder to compress. We're actually only using the encoder part of the autoencoder. We don't really reconstruct. And so what we wanted to see is what is mapped here is how does it, what we basically map on the left side is the latent code mapped with a dimensionality reduction. And what we're basically seeing, if you watch the video, it's a little hard to see maybe, but in the paper you also have more information, is that in similar situations, the car finds itself in mapped to similar areas on the left side of this visual representation. So all the areas where basically the car has to turn a sharp left turn are in some area, in the similar area in this dimensionality reduced representation of the latent code. And all the areas where it has to do a sharp right turn are in another area. So basically evolution discovered that this is a good encoding because it allows it to react similarly in situations that require a similar action. So if there's a situation where I have to turn sharp left, then all these situations should be represented similarly. So it's easier for me to know what to do in these situations. And then on the other hand, we also wanted to see on the right side, we also plot the representation of this forward model also, or we call it also this memory representation, where we see while it drives along the track, we plot the average kind of activation of this module. And we can see that it has a higher activation by seeing a larger, like a larger blob around like corners, while it has a lower activation when it's driving in straight lines. And this makes sense because you have to pay particular attention probably to what the forward model tells you when you have to drive sharp corners. That's when you have to really pay attention. That's where you have to do like some kind of planning ahead. While if you just drive straight, maybe it's not so important, you know, what your forward model thinks will happen next, because it's a very safe route. And so this was interesting for us, that evolution by itself, without us having to tell it, was basically able to come up with these interesting visual and memory representation. I don't know if we should with questions. I guess maybe I'll do it later if there are any questions.
Yeah, you can do it later. There was one, but was answered by Jean-Baptiste.
Okay, great. Okay. So then the question is, does this also work for more complex domains? So animals, of course, they don't just need to work on like just a 2D world, flat 2D world, but they also need to work in more slightly more complex 3D environments. And we're not quite there yet to have agents working in as complex environments as animals, but one step towards this ability is to allow them to work in more 3D or 2.5D kind of worlds. So we also wanted to see how does this approach work on this on the Visdoom domain. which is a little more complicated than this car driving domain. And so we tried the deep neuroevolution approach also on this Vistum, where here the monsters shoot fireballs at you, and you have to try to avoid them by strafing left and right, and you have to survive for so and so many time steps. And so we applied the same approach on this domain, and it did not work. So then we were thinking, why doesn't it work for this more complex domain? It's also not that it didn't work at all, but it didn't really solve the task. Didn't really get satisfactory performance. So then we were thinking, how can we improve on this original method of the very simple deep neuroevolution to make it work better? And the approach is quite simple, that we recently published in Toulouse AI, which we call deep innovation protection. And so the basic idea is that if there's a new innovation in one of the systems, for example, the visual encoder or this memory forward model component, then maybe the controller needs time to adapt to this new innovation, this change, which could ultimately be good, but maybe at the start it's more distracting. So one good analogy, I think, is that when you get new glasses, then maybe it will take you a while, even though it's a good change, it might take you a while to get adapted to being actually able to see. At least that's what I remember getting my first glasses, that at the start it was not very, it was very jarring to being able to see well. And so you might need some time to adapt. And that's basically the whole idea in this deep innovation protection, that when there's an innovation in the visual encoder or the memory system, then the controller needs time to adapt. And what we use here, and this is inspired by an approach by Nick Cheney that used this for virtual creatures, where we basically, what we do is we introduce an additional H objective. So now it becomes multi-objective evolutionary optimization. And this additional H objective, we set this H objective to 0 when either this visual encoder or this forward model changes, and lower H is better. So what this basically means that individuals can survive just by having a low H, and that gives, in each generation we increase this H, so that gives individuals whose controller just changed time to adapt, because they will not directly be sorted out through evolution. And so the whole intuition is that if you just randomly mutate one of these components, then the other components don't really have time to adapt to that change. And this is what this deep innovation protection is basically solving. And if you visualize here the individuals we are protecting, this is what's called the Pareto front. So you're visualizing like the best individuals, that the individuals across not just one objective, but two objectives. And one objective is, of course, task reward. So we want individuals that have a high task reward. At the same time, we would like individuals that have a low H, because they're the ones that we need to protect. And so we're basically selecting individuals on this Pareto front. So low H allows you to survive, but also a high reward allows you to survive, and everything kind of in between on this front. And then here's the algorithm also spelled out, but that's the whole trick. That we basically, every time we have these two objectives, we increase H every time, and then sometimes we reset H to 0 if these components got changed, because we not always change all the components at the same time, but we randomly pick one of those 3 components to change. And if one of those 2 gets changed, we reset H. That's the whole trick. And does it work? Yeah, it does work. So with this, we can actually solve this Vistum task. And so the blue line is this deep innovation protection. And then we tried a few different variations. We tried one where we, some reviewers said maybe it's just the more diversity because of H. So we also tried this kind of random H objective where we just randomly set this H, and this did work a little better, but not quite as good as deep innovation protection. And then we tried also some protecting the controller instead of the other parts, but all these approaches didn't quite work as well. What you see here is the red line is the standard deep neuroevolution where we don't use innovation protection. So it performs significantly worse than using this approach. And so we think this could be used for a lot of other, if you want to optimize complex neural architectures, whenever you have multiple components that somehow rely on each other, then this innovation protection could be useful because it basically addresses this challenge that you have to tune different components, maybe at different speeds, and you have to protect them in your evolutionary approach. And so this is a video where you see how the training progresses over generations. So starting from generation 24 all the way to 145 on the top right. And at the start, the agent is very bad. It basically doesn't really move at all. Actually, at the lower left, you see generation 0. So it just gets shot at and then dies pretty quickly. And over generations, you can see that it slowly starts to work better. So you're basically seeing a lineage here of the improvements. And at the end, at generation 145, it's quite competitive at solving the task. So it's good at avoiding these fireballs. Again, you need to plan a little bit ahead in this domain because it's not just reacting going left, right, but you don't want to get stuck in the far right or far left corners. And what you see on top is, again, here we visualized the autoencoder, the encoder part. How does it group different similar situations? And what we can see here is that it learned to group all the situations where you have to move left. It learned to group them together, and all the situations where you have to move right, it also learned to group them together. While at the start, at the first generation, black means it's not doing anything, so it doesn't have any good representation. But over time, you can see it quite nicely that it learned to separate those two states better and better, and ultimately being able to use that knowledge to avoid those. And then again, we were interested in what kind of representation does also the forward model learn? And what we basically find, so here you see an action sequence going from left to right, and here you see just another example. And the coloring is just for visualization purposes. It's not that the agent sees this color. And the more blue means the more this forward model is active. And what it actually discovered here is a warning system that if I would stay, it's basically, am I in the line of fire of a fireball? So if I would not move in this situation, I would certainly get hit. So it's basically like a warning system that tells me if I don't do anything here, I'm going to get shot, because it's predicting that this fireball would hit me. And here, in this case, it allows the agent to move away. In this case, the warning signals go on, but unfortunately, it was too late for the agent, so it still got hit. But we found this quite interesting. What are these representations that it comes up with without being rewarded to doing this? So kind of building on this work. So the one what you could say, the one drawback of this work is that we're basically only planning one step ahead. So this word model approach is the controller only gets the current state of the environment and the next state, and then based on that, it has to decide its actions. So if you need some kind of longer term planning, like multiple steps planning into the future, then this would be difficult with the basic word model approach. And so what we did here is we thought about, can we combine this ability of the word model to predict the next time step with a planning approach? And in this case, we use evolutionary planning. So there are also other approaches, like mu0 is doing something similar, but not with planned action. And also it works really well with continuous action. Because we use evolution, it's quite easy to use continuous action, which is more difficult if you use other approaches. And so basically here we took a step back. So we actually taken again the original word model by Ha and Schmidhuber, trained in a supervised way. So this is what you see here. You have this latent representation trained in a supervised way. You have this forward model trained in a supervised way. But then what we do here is we actually, we are evolving a plan in latent space and then taking the best plan and executing the first action. So if you have a model of the world that tells you, currently you're in this situation, and if I do this and this action, I get into the next situation, then we are basically evolving plans that are multi-action sequences. So I do this action, I get into this state. I get this action, I get into this state, and so on. And we evolve multiple ones of those. And you can see them actually, if you look at this image here, you can see the plan that the agent is kind of the sequences of actions that the agent is evolving in its imagination. So you can see the red one, which is the one that was ultimately chosen. But you can also see, I don't know how hard it is to see, it's quite small, but you can also see there are two other lines, which is alternative imagined trajectories that the agent is thinking about. And then because we have this forward model, we can actually decide, okay, this plan brought me into this situation, this plan brought me into this situation, and this plan into this situation. So which of these three is best? And in this case, the model that the agent learned decided that this one is best, the final state I'm in, and then you execute the first action of this plan, and then you plan again. So you always, this evolutionary planning is basically evolving a sequence in an imagination. Then I execute the first action of this imagined plan, and then I plan again and again and again. And that's the basic trick, and it allowed also this, it worked quite well. It doesn't work quite as well as the original model, and we're still working on improving it. But it shows the basic idea of this evolutionary planning in this latent state works. One thing is that there's this kind of chicken and egg problem, because for good planning, we need a good world model. And for a good world model to be trained, we need good data. So how do we get, if our agent at the start doesn't know anything, then we don't have good data to train our autoencoder or our forward model. So what we did here was an iterative version, an iterative refinement. So initially we had the agent drive around randomly and collected rollouts. And that's what we used to train the first VAE and the first forward model. And that's what you see here. And then we used that to plan. And while we did the planning and driving around with we collected more data. And then we retrained the system. And that's what you see after this iteration. And so after a few steps, by iteratively collecting data and bootstrapping from this data and retraining, you actually get quite good performance in this task. And here you can see a video. It's actually, it's actually driving better than you see in the video, but it's actually distracting for the agent because it works on the pixels to see these kind of planning trajectories. So there's another video we have that's linked to the paper where you see it driving a little better. But here we wanted to visualize kind of these plans it imagines in its mind, and then it executes them. And it could be that in this domain it's slightly subpar performance to state of the art, is because maybe the domain doesn't really require that extensive planning. But this is like research directions we're looking at right now. So it's able to perform quite well, but not as much as well as the other approaches. So that brings me to the second kind of theme of this presentation, where we're going to talk about one amazing ability is how quickly they can learn and how quickly then can adapt to new situations, how quickly they can learn to walk and react to, like damages to their bodies. And so can we, that's one of the kind of the holy grails of AI to get similar artificial agent, and there's a lot of progress there. And also Jean-Baptiste did a lot of work with his team on making robots adapt. And here we take a slightly different approach that does not use map elites, but we use instead this slightly more biologically inspired heavier learning in our networks to adapt quickly. And so what's the idea here? Networks trained through RL or evolution, they remain often static during their lifetime. So we train an agent, it performs well, but then we basically put the whole brain of the agent in a freezer, and there's no more adaptation happening. So which kind of limits its abilities to react to things that it hasn't seen during training. And so one kind of promising area is, can we instead of training the weights, can we train update rules that operate locally on each synapse of the network? So here you see, and this is an approach we didn't invent this approach. This has been around for a while, but we scaled it up now to more complex networks. But the basic idea is that you have 2 neurons in your network, and then you look at how much does each neuron activated, and you do this each time step. And then you calculate a new weight, the weight delta, based on, this is the activation of the presynaptic neuron. So this is the activation of the postsynaptic neuron. And then so basically you're changing the weight based on how much are these activated together, how much is just this, the presynaptic neuron activated, the postsynaptic neuron activated, and you have these additional parameters. So we don't, in our new work, we don't evolve the weights at all. So we always start with completely random weights each episode, but the only thing we evolve is these parameters A, B, C, D, and we evolve them for each synapse in the neural networks for these agents. So we wanted to see, by only doing basically Hebbian learning, how far can we scale this approach without even touching the weights during training. And only have the weights self-organized by these evolved rules. And so we used, again, our favorite car driving domain, and then we also used this quadruped domain where we would do some cool experiments and cut off, parts of the quadruped. And then we wanted to see, like, if we only train on this one and this one, can it generalize to still work on a morphology, a damaged morphology it hasn't seen before. And what you can see here is that you have to, it's hard to see it fast enough, but it's also, I can't rewind. But when you look at the start, if I go back, basically the images to the right, the initial networks are completely random. So you see on the right side, you see a visualization of the networks. And when I start this, it starts from a completely scrambled network. And in a few milliseconds, it's basically able to self-organize into these patterns you see. And there's actually a slight visualization bug. So it should not have these diagonal lines. It should still be self-organized, but I forgot to replace those. So imagine you see a different pattern, but just not these diagonal lines, they shouldn't be there. But very quickly, the weights self-organize through these learned rules, and the agent is able to directly learn and directly know how to drive. So, and there's no reward given during the lifetime of the agent. We gave a reward when we evolved the Hebbian rules, but not during the lifetime of the agent. So this reward is, this agent is learning in a completely kind of unsupervised way, based on it's finding some in the weight space, some attractor through these Hebbian rules, and that really quickly allows it to drive around the track, being able to solve the task. And then we also wanted to see how does it, so it should look like what you see here in the middle is an initial, the initial random initialization. And here again, we can see that very quickly a Hebbian network is able to basically self-organize and still work on all three morphologies, while on the right side, we see a static network that then basically, if you change the morphology, what has not been seen during training, it will fail, and the agent will not know what to do anymore. And so this happens after very few, under 100 time steps that these weights self-organize. So it is a form, it is getting a little bit closer to how animals learn, in the sense that it's very quickly, that what basically these innate properties that evolution discovered, which is the learning rules, help this initial network to very quickly perform well. And so kind of wrapping up, and so we have some time if people have questions. So basically neuroevolution is able to scale to more complex 3D tasks by adding like minor modifications, which allow these, for example, these different components in the network to adapt. So this deep innovation approach allows us to also now tackle more complex 3D problems by protecting the different parts in the network. And what we have also seen is that this kind of Hebbian meta-learning, so instead of evolving the weights directly, you just evolve learning rules, allows agents to very quickly adapt. And so one interesting future direction in this work is to, can we also incorporate the reward into the system? So currently these agents their brains will wire up based on the innate learning rules they have. But if I wanted to teach this agent now to walk backward instead of forward, or not pick up the red fruit, but the green fruit, it will not be able to learn what to do because it does not have this reward from the environment. So if the environment changes in some, if the reward is basically non-stationary, we need to incorporate the reward also in this learning system. The other interesting direction that we are exploring is, and we just had a paper accepted at Gecko, where maybe you don't need a separate rule for each connection in the network. So that quickly leads to an explosion of parameters, because each connection now, instead of needing just the weight, needs 5 parameters. So quickly you have a large number of parameters. But in evolution, actually in nature, as John Baptiste also was talking about, you have these things like indirect encodings, developmental encodings. So you can reuse information in different parts of the brain. So now we are exploring this idea, also called the idea of a genetic bottleneck, so that you can reuse this information. And we showed in our recent Gecko work that can actually reduce the number of rules by a factor of like over 300, having a much smaller rule set where synapses actually share rules in the network. And that actually leads to even more, that leads to better generalization. And then also some work that we did with hybrid approaches. So we showed this kind of evolutionary planning, taking advantage of a world model, and being able to train it with gradient descent, and then using this planning and this combination. I think there's also a lot of potential there for future work. So I just wanted to thank all the collaborators that helped work on this problems, and also the funding we got. And with that, thank you very much for your attention, and happy to answer any questions.
So thank you very much, Sebastian, for this great, inspiring talk, full of interesting techniques and tricks and results. There are indeed a few questions still unanswered, so I will just go in order. First one is, how is evolutionary planning different from Monte Carlo tree search?
Yeah, so actually those two are quite related. And so we have actually a paper where we look at the difference between Monte Carlo tree search and evolutionary planning. So one advantage that evolutionary planning has, that it easily works with also continuous actions.
Okay.
So with Monte Carlo tree search, it would be a little harder if you have continuous action. You need to do some chunking or some other approaches. But with this evolutionary planning, the actions can be anything, and you only have to basically have a forward model that gives you the next state, and a fitness function that tells you how good the state is. So in that sense, it's a little more flexible. But we also thought about using Monte Carlo tree search. You could also do that, but for us it was just easier to use the other approach.
Okay. And the second question is, are these concepts, can these concepts be applied to a non-visual based environment?
Yeah, it doesn't require the vision-based environment. So this idea of this happy and learning idea, for example, has also been applied. So Andrea Saltoggio and his team have done a lot of things also in more abstract kind of task like a T-maze that doesn't really have this kind of pixel representation. So they can also be used for more abstract tasks where you have to learn quickly. It doesn't have to be visual. It's actually probably going to be easier if you don't have to do this from pixels, but if you can do it from another representation.
Okay, great. And are there alternatives to VAE-based environment representations that show similar performance?
Yeah, I think I don't know that there's so many different ones. I mean, you could also, maybe you could use some other, maybe you could somehow use some GAN representation as well. But I think for these controller type architectures, I think this variational autoencoder is this kind of the standard that people normally use. If you're looking into generating artifacts, I think then you can use a lot of different approaches like GANs. And we also did some work in generating like Mario levels with GANs combining with evolution. But if you need this kind of in a controller, I think these VAEs seem to be the best option currently.
Okay, great, thank you. And can we use Hebbian meta-learning and social learning to improve performance in autonomous driving?
I think so. So one thing and that's actually something we are exploring right now with a large-scale project in the US with partners in the US, and also John Baptiste is also part of this team where we're trying to scale up these approaches to work for this CALA autonomous driving domain. So CALA is a more realistic simulator than the one I showed you before, where you have this simple 2D task. And so we definitely think that you could scale them up, but you probably need a slightly more complex system with that has more components and to scale it up to make it work there.
Right, that would be very exciting to see.
Yeah.
Any recommendations on resources for people starting to learn about Hebbian networks? They seem incredibly useful.
Yes, so I can actually, so there's this paper we wrote with Andrea Sotoggio and Ken Stanley. Actually, I can write it in there.
I think you can type on the chat, yeah.
So, so there's this paper, Born to Learn, that was published in Neural Networks. So that has a good, I think, is a good review paper, a good place to start to learn more about these evolving plastic neural networks.
Great. The next question would be, how can we make sure that the Hebbian meta-learning does not adapt, quote unquote, to the wrong behavior?
Yeah, so I mean, one thing is the way you train it. So you have to set up. So if we would have only trained, like, for example, the quadruped on one task, it might not have learned the ability to adapt to another task, because it's evolution will exploit whatever is easiest. So it might just have learned to control this one morphology. So I think the only way kind of to make sure it doesn't adapt to the wrong behavior is to train it on a large number of different environments, and then you try to bias it towards learning the thing you wanted to learn. So that's kind of the only thing. If you don't have the reward explicitly incorporated like what we did, then the only way is to kind of train it on a large number of different environments and trying to bias it towards learning the right thing, which would be like locomoting forward, like no matter what your morphology kind of looks like.
Okay, thank you. And one last question is, can we somehow include the weight regularization like L2 or L1 in evolutionary learning DeepNet, similarly to SGD?
Yeah, so there is actually this evolution strategy that we use for training the parameters of these Hebbian rules, actually uses some weight regularization, uses like weight decay. So you can include those as well in your, and that seems to help in this domain. So there's nothing that restricts you from not also including them when you calculate like the fitness of your individual.